going to start the presentation here. Per usual, I've got a short introductory video that we'll kick things off with, and then I'll bring David up to introduce our presenter today. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. We've got our members coming in on Zoom. We've got some people following along on Facebook Live. We are now live for this presentation. We're looking forward to a good presentation today. We are going to have, as we usually do, live Q&A with our presenter after the prepared statement. So start getting those questions into chat. As soon as they come to you, we'll jump right into that. We've already had a couple questions submitted during the registration process, so we'll make sure all those get brought in. And we're just going to go ahead and get started. So I will turn the meeting over to our Vice President, Mr. David Bean.
Thank you, Mike. And it is my pleasure to welcome back to the World Affairs Council a presenter who is no stranger to us, Dr. Thomas Wright, who's going to speak to us today about his latest book, Aftershocks, Pandemic Politics, and the End of the Old International Order. Tom is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe and a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy at Brookings. He is also a contributing writer for The Atlantic and a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. He is the author of All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, which was published by Yale University Press in 2017. Tom's academic focus includes United States foreign policy, great power competition, the EU, Brexit, and economic interdependence. Tom has a doctorate from Georgetown, a Master of Philosophy from Cambridge, and a bachelor's and master's from University College Dublin. He has also held a pre-doctoral fellowship at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and a post-doctoral fellowship at Princeton. He was previously executive director of studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and a lecturer at the University of Chicago's Harris School for Public Policy. Tom, welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. So should I go ahead and get started?
Yes.
Great. It's a great pleasure to be back, albeit virtually, and I look forward to being able to do so in person, hopefully in the not too distant future. So I thought what I'd do in the time allotted to me before we have the conversation, which I'm very keen to engage in, is just to say a bit about why we did the book. The book is co-authored with my friend and colleague Colin Call, who has since gone into government, so isn't with us today to talk about it. But we sort of originally, discussed this last April or May, when the shutdown, the lockdown had happened, and when it was becoming clear that we were in the middle of a major event. And Colin and I had both written separate pieces on the long-term geopolitical consequences of the pandemic as it looked at that very early stage. And he called me up and said, this really could be a book. I mean, this is we're both sort of on the same page in terms of the consequence of this, but it's a global story. It's taking place at a particularly inopportune moment, let's say, geopolitically, and it would be interesting to sort of look out. Now, we thought at that point, we were looking at sort of a relatively short book, maybe on our sort of thinking about what the implications would be. But as we sort of look closer into it, it did sort of strike us that it was important in real time to analyze and document what was actually happening in the middle of this crisis, because the 2020 was sort of a unique moment in modern history when we had a truly global crisis but no geopolitical cooperation, no international leadership to speak of. Nationalist governments were in power in, the United States, in India, in Brazil, and elsewhere. We had a very authoritarian, even dictatorial government in China. And so if you think back to 2008, when there was a financial crisis and the world came together to address this, in 2020, many world leaders weren't even speaking to each other, let alone coming together to address it. So for us, 2020 was important on its own terms in terms of how the world would deal with the pandemic, but it's also important as an example of how the world copes or fails to cope with a major crisis in an age of nationalism and rivalry. So that's sort of the story, we try to tell in the book. We talk to quite a large number of officials on background to try to find out what was really happening behind the scenes. We benefited tremendously from the extraordinary work of reporters around the world. This is the biggest story in the world, and most major media outlets really dove into every aspect of it. So we benefited from that and the great work of other analysts and commentators on the pandemic. And we wanted to produce something that would tell that story, but would also hopefully have some important takeaways for preparing for future pandemics. So I'll just go through and highlight some of the things, that really sort of stood out to us in the book. And it is an effort to paint a global picture. We try to look not just at the United States, China and Europe, but also the developing world, Bangladesh, Peru, Rwanda. We look at the economic piece of the picture, the effect on democracy. So we really are trying to give that global picture. But having said that, I'll start out with the United States and China, because this is sort of a big theme of the book, that the two major superpowers now, the two major powers in the world, really defined the response or lack of response to the pandemic globally. And I'll start out with China, because that's where the COVID-19 originated from. So if you think about China and you think about global public health, what's sort of remarkable coming into 2020 is that tremendous progress have been made from the last time there was a epidemic in China in 2003 with SARS. In 2003, China was uncooperative initially with the WHO, quite secretive in its response to then Director General of the WHO called China out. There was a change in the attitudes in Beijing, some more cooperation, but generally speaking, SARS was seen as a failure in terms of response. And in the 17 years since, there were major reforms in China, particularly domestically, but also in greater interaction with the international community and global public health, to ensure a more transparent and cooperative and effective approach the next time there was a major outbreak. And those new reforms were part and parcel of various exercises and even of real-time responses to other diseases that emerged in that time frame. But what we saw in 2018-19 was an erosion of those reforms within China, maybe less cooperation with the WHO, with the United States and global public health. And then when the pandemic hit in December 2019, those reforms not completely, but for the most part, melted away. The Chinese Center for Disease Control, which is modeled on the US CDC, have been placed front and center. They were largely cut out of the loop early on. The head of the Chinese CDC actually found out about the pandemic online from social media rather than through the mechanisms that were actually set up for reporting between the provinces and central authorities in China. Of course, there was quite a secretive response. There was a lack of transparency with the WHO, a failure to share critical data and information, a crackdown on the doctors and others who were speaking up about what was happening. And so while China did suppress the virus early on in Wuhan after that initial outbreak, there was a lack of cooperation with the international community, and then a building on that with a more assertive foreign policy that demonstrated that really what we were seeing was a rerun of 2003, only maybe worse in this instance. And so that really is an important takeaway, I think, because it sort of demonstrates that this wasn't meant to happen. We weren't meant to see the type of response from China that we saw. We were meant to see other sort of mechanisms come into place to ensure that there wasn't a rerun of SARS. So that, I'll come back to that later on, but that I think is an important baseline for not just understanding how we got to this point, but also in terms of understanding where we go from here. How do we repair cooperation with China? Is there a possibility of having greater pandemic preparedness with China as a key part of that? In the United States, it's sort of a different story, right? We know that Donald Trump said lots of things about COVID-19 that were outrageous, especially in the press conferences. We know he dismissed it early on, but when we looked into what the track record actually was within the administration, it was quite interesting that there were several senior officials in the Trump administration who understood, possibly earlier than any other government outside of Taiwan, in terms of what the threat was that COVID posed to the international community and to the US economy and to the national interest. The Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, had been a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in China during SARS, and has sort of cut his teeth as a young reporter on that story, and had been quite suspicious of China and on the more hawkish side of the debate inside the Trump administration. So he was primed in a way to be concerned about this issue. Fauci, Redfield, and others all were aware and active on it from an early point, and they did push Trump into imposing a travel ban on January 25th. So the Trump administration actually was more engaged early on in worrying about COVID as a national security threat than, say, European countries were. But where the battle was largely lost was in February. And in February, with the warning, with the awareness, that was a moment when investment and preparations needed to be made on diagnostics and testing, on therapeutics and treatment, and generally on production of critical medical supplies, and thinking how the country could prepare if and when the pandemic hit American shores and resulted in the type of developments that we'd already seen in Wuhan. And what actually happened in that February period was a debate inside the administration between those who said, including Pottinger and others, this really is like 1918, this is a global pandemic and we need to be ready. And those who said, including the president, we've already done our bit with the travel ban. We don't really need to do much else, and we shouldn't do anything to disrupt the economy or disrupt, our political fortunes going into an election year. And that debate, that second group, basically won that argument. And so the United States lost 5 critical weeks, or 6 critical weeks, really, from the imposition of the travel ban on China on January 25th. Through to March 11th, when Trump announced that he was shutting down the economy to stop the spread of the virus. So the Trump administration's initial reaction, I think, was a bit more mixed than is sort of widely appreciated. Once the shutdown happened, Trump turned with a vengeance on Xi Jinping and on China, who he basically had been trusting or repeating their assurances to him. He would repeat those publicly. But when he had to shut down the economy and he realized the threat that COVID posed to his own political fortune, he then at that point blamed China for that. And he switched inside the administration from supporting those who saw the China problem in more narrow trade and economic terms to those who saw it as a more general geopolitical rivalry requiring various containment measures across the board. And from that point forward, the Trump administration actually took on and adopted a lot more hardline policies on China that were more in keeping with the rhetoric that had been employed to that point. But the rhetoric had been alone prior to March of 2020, when those policy measures on technology restrictions and sanctions and other things that would come later that year weren't in place. So to us, COVID was actually a key moment in this US-China rivalry. And what we saw then over the course of 2020 is that rivalry really shaped and constrained the entire pandemic response, and nowhere more so than the WHO, which brings me on to the third key takeaway on the World Health Organization. Because when the Director General, Tedros of the WHO, started out during COVID, he really was faced with this absolutely sort of appalling geopolitical vista, where on the one hand, you had a Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, who was not cooperating with the international community. And on the other hand, you had a Trump administration that was, let's put it mildly, highly skeptical of multilateral institutions, of the United Nations, and of international commitments more generally. Now, Tedros believed that he had a plan to deal with this, and that was using his own diplomatic ability to work with the different leaders, to praise them publicly, to encourage them, and then to get some incremental practical cooperation on the ground to try to deal with this pandemic. And he pursued that initially in China, where he praised Xi Jinping's response. He managed to secure a visit to China near the end of January, where he was impressed by the response, but gave a press conference in which he flattered the Chinese leader. And that was at odds with what the WHO officials were saying internally, that they were concerned that it was a rerun of 2003, that the Chinese authorities were not actually sharing the type of information that the WHO required. When the United States shut down the economy and turned on China to blame it for the pandemic, the WHO at that point then was clearly in the sights of the Trump administration, because they were able to sort of conflate China and the WHO and say that China lied to the international community, but it was the WHO's fault for being complicit in that. And that meant that for the rest of 2020, we had a situation where the main objective of the United States was to try to change or reform or ultimately pull out of the World Health Organization in real time during a pandemic, which set it on a collision course with its allies. And that really, I think, complicated not just the international response, but also the diplomatic space to try to get to get agreement, not just on what to do, but also how to think about the pandemic, because it became more representative of a US-China rivalry than it was of a global health problem. And so we didn't see the type of comprehensive and holistic response in the developing world in engaging in vaccine diplomacy. The US and China, neither of them were a part of COVAX. Throughout this period, both joined China late in 2020 in the US after the election and inauguration of Joe Biden. So we saw just a lack of action, and the main sort of points of contention were by Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who would push the idea that other countries ought to sign on to the notion that the WHO had been corrupted by China and that the virus was named sort of the China virus, and that actually resulted in the breakdown of negotiations on a communique at the G7 at the ministerial level. Trump did try to bring the G7 together in person in June, but the situation had gotten so bad between the leaders at that point that Merkel felt that it would only make matters worse, actually, and she pulled out of that in a phone call with Trump the night before he announced he was actually pulling out of the World Health Organization. So if you look at these three different key actors in this, the United States, China, and the WHO, each, I think, had their performance heavily sort of limited or compromised by the presence of nationalism and geopolitical rivalry. So that, I think, is one big part of the story. However, the story isn't entirely negative. There were actually various instances of cooperation that occurred almost by accident, or certainly without formal coordination. And I just highlight two that are particularly interesting. One is the financial response. And we talked to several officials at the Federal Reserve and in the European Central Bank. And what was very clear was that 2020 worried them maybe more so even than 2008, that they believed that 2020 could have been worse than the 08-09 financial crisis because of the threat that was posed to the Treasury market, and that there was a general sell-off of US Treasuries, that there was a major sort of problem there that needed to be addressed. And the US Federal Reserve reacted in a very large and significant way very early on, using some of the tools that they had acquired in 08 and 09 and since. And the ECB, after an initial wobble, came in at a similar scale in Europe. And so you did have the bolstering of the financial system. But without that, those officials believed that, as one put it to us, the core was about to blow and they were looking over the edge of the abyss. And as bad as the pandemic has been, it would have been much worse had it been accompanied by a financial crisis. What is interesting from just a foreign policy point of view and an international relations point of view is that those actions occurred without formal cooperative meetings or without multilateralism. And what the officials said to us is the phrase they used is, this is correlation without coordination. So there was not formal coordination, but everyone sort of did the right thing on their own, and those actions reinforced each other. So that was quite a good example, I think, of the international system working even when it didn't work. So we didn't have the formal mechanisms in place, but it still had an effect. And the second area is on vaccine development. The United States was out of COVAX throughout 2020, but what the United States did in Operation Warp Speed and the amount of money and cutting of red tape that happened in that made an extraordinary difference in the rapid development of a vaccine that surprised almost everyone in terms of its timeline. What we saw was that they tried to shrink the amount of time that was needed for everything other than the testing of the vaccine itself. So they would build factories that wouldn't be used if there was any prospect it might work. They invested in a number of companies, any company that had a plausible sort of theory of success, including companies like Novavax that hadn't actually ever developed a successful vaccine before. I think the European Union's total spend on vaccine development was less than 3 billion. The United States spent over $18 billion. And so it really was an attempt to invent one's way out of the problem. And the extraordinary thing is, it worked, and it meant that we had a vaccine by November, December, and of course, shots in arms this year. So that was another example, I think, of where you saw maybe the multilateral system failing because countries weren't a part of COVAX and it was under-resourced. But we did see some unilateral action that had a beneficial effect. So those were two areas, but we did also see aftershocks in other areas that were negative. The developing world in particular sort of avoided the worst of the pandemic early on, but it was hit by the downturn in the global economy and by the effects of the lockdown that it was unable to cope with because people weren't in a position where they would be able to socially distance from each other or to engage in their work remotely. And so countries like Bangladesh, Peru, India, and others really did suffer. And those are the countries that did very well over the last 20 years, but then suffered this reversal. So throughout all of those areas, I think 2020 was significant, but really, and I'll sort of close on this, what its ultimate significance is, I think, is in terms of what it means about the future. Where are we headed from here? Because COVID-19 was not the most lethal pandemic that one could imagine. Scientists prior to COVID-19 believed that the next pandemic could be more lethal. It will be as contagious, but more lethal. It would not sort of give young people and younger people a pass, that it could affect them disproportionately, even just as the pandemic, the great influenza, did in 1919. So this, in a way, is a warning. It's a warning to the world about what could happen. One thing we found was that the countries that responded well initially were those that had major crises before, those that had experienced SARS or MERS and had a scandal about their reaction and managed to improve. So this should be that way for the United States and for other countries to get ready for the next time. And the question is, what can we do? And are we well prepared for it? And I think the answer unambiguously is we should be very worried about the next pandemic, and we should be worried about coming up short in terms of preparedness. And I would just mention a few sort of reasons for that, and then some of the suggestions that we have for it. The first is in the United States, the pandemic has become a partisan issue. This is a theme we explore in the book, how the very notion of objective truth is becoming contested, how social media and other sources of disinformation, including the President of the United States and the government of China, really undermined public confidence in institutions, in authorities, and that is proceeding forward to the point where many people believe the problem was the overreaction, not the lack of preparedness. So that's a challenge that needs to be addressed. Geopolitically, the issue is that global public health could become a zone of contestation between the United States and China. So the US and China may end up sort of fighting within the WHO, just as the United States and the Soviet Union fought with each other diplomatically at the United Nations after World War II. So what do? We need cooperation from China on pandemics. But a key question we try to answer in the book is, what do we do if that cooperation is not forthcoming? What's our backup plan to global cooperation and sort of healing the international order on this and other issues? And our answers to that is that the United States, in addition to working within the WHO and trying to work with China, the United States needs a backup plan of working with like-minded countries who will commit to a higher level of standard on transparency and the provision of global public goods and formal cooperation and coordination in the event of a crisis. Maybe set up what we call a global alliance for pandemic preparedness of like-minded countries that would do that would operate in parallel to the World Health Organization, and maybe in a position to even impose sanctions on other countries in the context of another pandemic if there wasn't enough cooperation from the country concerned. So that's sort of one of our major proposals, I think, for how we ought to prepare going forward. I would just finish on one note, and then I very much look forward to questions, which is, as much as we talk about a post-pandemic world, we are not in a post-pandemic world yet. We still have the pandemic. There's a vaccine summit next week that I think will be a critical moment in the response. But at the G7 meeting in June, the G7 committed 870 million new vaccines in the world, which sounds like a lot, but is actually less than 10% of what the WHO said was required. They estimated we need 11 billion doses internationally to vaccinate the world to a 70% level. There are enormous problems, not just of production, but of distribution in that. So the G7 announcement was less than 10% of that assessment, and it's probably even grown since in terms of the number that are needed because of boosters and other considerations that have been learned since then. So we really need to collectively up our game, because we have a narrow window of opportunity to defeat COVID-19 before variants emerge that are resistant to vaccines, and before we see a divided world with sort of a hyper global inequality between a safe part and an unsafe part, and all of the implications that could flow from that. So I will, Mike, I will stop there, but I really look forward to elaborating in any and all of that, and maybe some issues that I didn't raise yet, and to your questions and comments. Thank you.
I was messaging Saul. We're gonna have him come in and do some announcements, and then we'll come right back for the Q&A. If you've got questions, start getting them into chat. We've had a few come in, and I also dropped a link in chat to Tom's article that was in the Atlantic, essay that he wrote based on the book. So after the presentation, you can go check that out. But the link's there for you if you want to start looking through that. Saul?
All right. Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Dr. Wright. I think we are going to have some good questions for you as the rest of our time here unfolds. But while people reflect on that, we think we have a really, really good set of the upcoming programs through December, which is what I'll just share with you briefly.
We lost your audio, Saul. And your video.
Okay, well, I thought it was unmuted. I beg your pardon. Well, thank you, Dr. Wright. As we prepare for some questions and answers for you, let me just review with our audience what we have upcoming. New wine for new wineskins. The way forward for Caribbean tourism in the post-pandemic era. Once again, we're discussing the pandemic and a perspective there. As most of us, I think, understand, the pandemic really hit tourism badly worldwide, and in the Caribbean, Dr. Mill will be addressing that. That's a timely topic for us, and one that maybe it's a different perspective for some of us, or a different kind of topic. We have The Unexpected Spy with Tracy Walder on October 5. And I think I'll leave it at that. She has a book that she'll be sharing with us. Our program is co-sponsored with the Jewish Federation of Writing. Leave it at that, The Unexpected Spy. Enough mystery. October 27, just now established, Dr. Larry Woodson from the Army War College in Carlisle will be presenting on Afghanistan. It will be the first of 2 such presentations we have yet this year. And obviously, again, very timely. Returning to us on the topic of cybersecurity is Captain Paul Tortera, who spoke to us, I believe it was within the past 3 years, on this very topic. He is the director of the Center for Cybersecurity Studies and was the first chair of the new Cyber Science Department at the United States Naval Academy. Retired from there now, he'll be presenting to us.
Lost your audio again, Saul. Did you mute yourself, Saul? Are you there? All right, having some audio problems with Saul, so I think we're gonna jump back in.
I don't know why, Mike, this is, let me just finish by saying this, but we're back and forth on it. So go to our website. You'll see the different speakers that are upcoming that we have posted, one that not yet posted on Afghanistan at the end of this month, at the end of November, rather, at the end of October, rather, excuse me. Look at those, and we think you'll find and agree that we have a lot of good presentations upcoming. All right, thank you, Mike.
Thanks, all. And I will just mention that tomorrow evening at 7 p.m., I will be hosting WAC Trivia Live once again. So you come check that out with us, wacwriting.org/trivia to get the connection details, and we'll also email you a few minutes before we get started. All right, so great presentation, Tom. I appreciate you joining us today. I did drop the link to your essay in The Atlantic for our members to check out. Towards the end of your presentation, as you were wrapping up, you started talking about looking forward next time. It still feels, at least to me, like we're kind of very much still in the middle of this time, or I mean, hopefully towards the end, but we've already had maybe a false start in the early summer. Where would you guess we are in the timeline? Like, are we ready for after action reports, or what do you expect the timeline to look like for the next 6 months to a year?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think the after action report started almost immediately. There were reports from the Council on Foreign Relations and others about pandemic preparedness as early as, the early summer of 2020. So that's a conversation that I think will continue, to happen. But as I mentioned at the end, we're not over the pandemic, certainly not globally. And I think that has to remain, the primary area of focus. In terms of where we are in that, we are in an exponentially better position, obviously, because of the vaccines than we would be without them. If we were facing into Delta, this winter, and Delta basically means that social distancing and masks and other measures aren't really possible to slow the spread. I mean, it's just too, contagious. They can help, but obviously it's much more contagious than the original variant of COVID. If we weren't sort of facing that, I think we would still very much be in the middle of the pandemic and probably closer to the worst sort of moment of it this winter. But the vaccines really do help in countries that have them. So they, impose a ceiling really on how bad it can get. Obviously, that varies according to the percentage of the population that's vaccinated. So here in the United States, there's a crisis of the unvaccinated, obviously, and there's resistance among certain parts of the population to getting vaccinated, and that is a problem. But we still are much better off than we would have been without the vaccine. So I think we're closer, much closer to the end than to the middle, let alone the beginning. But this will drag on in different ways. And, to use the title of the book, there will be aftershocks from this that we need to cope with for several years to come. And there will be variants, Delta and others, and that mean we're never quite back to normal in the short term. So I think that's something that we need to sort of focus on. But at the same time, I think we also need to think about what the lessons are from this period, because if we don't learn the right lessons quickly, we're unlikely to learn them at a later point, and we're certainly unlikely to convert those into actions that will result in real policy change. So I think we do need to have that conversation now, about what we should do to prepare for future pandemics.
And when you mentioned future pandemics, I guess the other thought I had was, are we really concerned about future viruses, or is it just going to continue to be an evolution of this virus that we've already been dealing with? And maybe it doesn't maybe that's a distinction without a difference, but
well, it could be both.
Tough to think about. Yeah.
You could have the variants and you could have a new one. We never know when a new one will emerge, but if you look at the last sort of 17 years, there was SARS, H1N1, Ebola, obviously MERS, a new sort of a strain of bird flu recently over the last 2 or 3 years ago. So these developments are coming pretty rapidly. Now, hopefully, we don't have something again like COVID, but we also need to be prepared for that, because we thought we were prepared before and we weren't. And so the question is, if this is pandemic 1 and we go into, as Bill Gates said, pandemic 2 or 3 in 10, 20, 30 years time, have we learned the right lessons? Are we more ready than we were in December 2019?
Yeah, I've got some questions starting to come in from the audience here, so I'm just going to try and keep track of everything. In your article, you talk about how China kind of moved backwards. They had after SARS, they had become a little bit more transparent. Now with COVID, under new leadership, they became much more opaque. But at the same time, there was some cooperation from inside China, maybe just not through the government. One of my understanding is part of the reason we developed the vaccine so quickly is because we did get that initial RNA mapping from the scientists on site, and we're very quickly able to create the vaccine. And then the additional time was for the testing, which we were able to streamline through Project Warp Speed. I guess the question is, can you speak to maybe the original skepticism? One of the questions that came in from Kevin Calabria asked about the concerns expressed by Biden before the election, and now the apparent turnaround, getting the vaccines out. What was, we did produce the vaccine very quickly. Why was there that skepticism now, and what changed?
Sure. Do you want me to also address was there a first part of the question on China as well, or no?
I was just kind of accepting the premise of your article, but if you want to talk about that also, feel free.
Yeah, just briefly mention that in a slightly different way, and then address the Biden question. Just on Chinese cooperation, they did share the sequencing of the virus in mid-January, but actually that was shared by a Chinese scientist in collaboration with an Australian-based scientist in defiance of an order from the government not to share it. So they leaked it basically to the world, and then the next day, Beijing formally shared it. So there were real problems with sort of data sharing at that point. In terms of, and have been really ever since, in terms of Biden's role and what was said in advance of the election, I think it was very clear that Donald Trump was all in, on the vaccine. He didn't really have a plan to address the pandemic, except for, putting money into the vaccine, which was a big deal, obviously. And we give him credit. We give the administration some credit in the book for doing that. But that was never going to come on stream in time enough to be able to deal with, the winter wave and what happened last fall. And so there needed to be a plan. And I think there was a legitimate concern, that since he, had no other option, and that he might put pressure, on the pharmaceutical firms and on the FDA to approve vaccines early. That didn't transpire. That didn't happen, I think, because the system actually was quite independent and was quite, and was quite effective. But the president had form on this in terms of what he did in other areas and trying to tailor things for political purposes. So I think that the criticism that Biden and others made was more focused on Trump, sort of the individual, rather than on the system as a whole. But I do think there is some, obviously it has become politicized. It was politicized then for that reason, and since, for very different reasons. And that, I think, has had an effect on public, sentiment overall.
Many of the questions that have come in, possibly all of them, are coming in with a political aspect to them. So I think I'll probably just start at the top and work my way down. David Carroll, past president of the World Affairs Council here, asks, what are the prospects for getting enough vaccines for the world? And what are the political implications of having a split world of largely vaccinated and largely unvaccinated countries?
Yeah, we can do it if we want to. The IMF estimates that the IMF or the World Bank, I think the IMF estimates that the cost of the pandemic from the beginning through 2025 will be $22 trillion or maybe more. That's just an enormous sum of money. So if you think about the cost of that, anything really that we would spend on vaccine development and distribution or in a global vaccination effort is just sort of pennies on the dollar compared to what it's actually costing us, in real time, just economically, and financially. So I think this is definitely something that can be afforded. I think it's something, that needs to be, done. But I think the problem is that it's increasingly viewed, not increasingly, but it is certainly viewed in a way as foreign assistance or development or a good thing we're doing for the world, as opposed to something that is necessary to deal with this sort of existential, challenge. And so we need, I think, to change our thinking that this isn't about, development assistance. This is really, about addressing the latest front, in the fight against COVID-19. In terms of the long-term implications, I think this is an incredibly, important question. And I worry about this, and especially even in the context of the travel, restrictions and issue, that we could be seeing a world of blocks, emerge after the pandemic, where countries are on blocks are largely inward looking. There's travel internally, maybe a little less than before, but there's a lot less interaction, internationally, a lot less travel. And the problem when you get into the vaccination, inequity is that you may very well have a situation where wealthy parts of the world are vaccinated around 70%, or higher. Things are relatively flexible between them in terms of travel and engagement. But the unvaccinated parts at a lot lower level, and they will face many more restrictions. They won't be able to come visit. They might not be able to, it'll be hard to come study. There'll be much less exchange. That will have an effect on trade and economic interaction. And that, that will be done under the guise of global public health. Those restrictions will be in place because of legitimate health concerns, but it cuts along socioeconomic, geopolitical, ethnic and national lines. And I think it will have a very dangerous sort of impact if in place over time. So I do worry about this turbocharging, global inequality. And I think, and this might come up at the vaccine summit potentially, where follow-ons, we need not just a plan for getting the world vaccinated, we also need a plan for how to get back, to normal, and to make the commitment that we actually want to see, an open world, maybe a little bit more managed, with a little more preparation for, gray rhinos and black swans, in the future. But we do fundamentally want to get back to that idea of sort of openness and of interdependence.
Yeah, that goes to the divisions between countries and blocs as you describe it. Saul asks that you had briefly addressed the political partisanship within the United States in our response to the pandemic. Do you find similar dynamics within other countries and other areas of the world, maybe specifically European democracies and India?
In terms of divisions, yeah, I mean, for sure, different divisions, maybe not quite as acute on the vaccine side, as here. But all these countries were, divided, and the pandemic response became contentious. In many of them, there were many riots in Europe over lockdowns that were more severe, than they were here. Some of the worst took place in the Netherlands earlier this year. So it is a very politically, contentious issue. It's interesting that if you look, Mike, at the different types of responses in governments, we think, I think with reason, that Europe at various points handled it better, than the United States, because leaders generally, didn't sort of dismiss the virus as a myth or as not being important. There were more stringent lockdowns. But if you look at the fatality numbers now, the EU numbers are higher than America's, and when adjusted for population, roughly the same. So, all around the world, there were many different responses, but it netted out in a similar way, in Europe and the United States and in Latin America. Asia is obviously a bit of a different, example because of the degree of the suppression, of the virus early on.
I'm gonna jump ahead to the question that just came in from Nicholas Nicoletti then about IGOs. He sets the stage by saying, looking at this crisis from the lens of liberal institutionalism, international interdependence, and cooperation, does the way some countries responded to COVID-19 force us to question whether our current IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, are equipped to force cooperation during a time of crisis? Or do you have ideas for how these organizations might be reformed to make them better dealing things like the humanitarian crisis, climate change, and COVID-19?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it really demonstrates the limitations of those organizations, and that, when the major powers are engaged in a geopolitical rivalry, and when there's, an authoritarian government in China that has little interest in cooperating, and a nationalist populist in the United States, then, things are going to break down. And that's exactly what happened. Because ultimately, as you know, as the audience knows, these institutions are collections of member states. They're not really independent actors in that sense. There are things they could do that would improve it, unilaterally maybe, but they are also constrained, by their member states. So I think it does demonstrate the limitations of that. There were many proposals for reforms to the WHO. Many of them recommend giving the WHO the type of intrusive surveillance capacity that the IAEA has when it comes to nuclear proliferation. Those reforms have never happened, and I don't think they're going to happen now, because ultimately China, but not just China, other states too, won't want to give the WHO that authority. And even in the case of the IAEA, those authorities have to be mandated by the UN Security Council, where China and the US and others are members. So they could veto it if it was applied to them in the future. So, we will definitely, I think, the country will definitely try to engage in the WHO, try to get reforms. The WHO, I think, is very important and an important part of the response. But as I mentioned in the remarks and in the article, we also need a backup plan, to be ready if that breaks down, if the reforms don't happen. And the idea we have is the one I mentioned about setting up a separate, alliance of like-minded countries that would set higher standards. We think that is basically a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. I mean, there's, if the United States and like-minded countries want to spend much more on vaccines and also internationally, and also commit to higher levels of transparency and cooperation, that's a good thing, right? That's not a negative thing in any way. So we think that will help, but we are in, I think, for a rocky sort of future in that the global public health is going to be constrained and shaped by these geopolitical tensions.
So another question from Dave Carroll. He says, it seems recently that liberal democracy was ascending around the world, and asks what happened. So I guess, do you agree with the premise of the question? And then was the pandemic a setback for this movement?
Yeah, I mean, democracy's been in trouble for a few years. You know, Freedom House has documented this in a number of annual reports about democracy in retreat. There's some people refer to it as a democratic recession. You know, we've seen the erosion of democratic institutions and of norms in the United States as well as in parts of Europe. So it's affecting the core, not just the periphery. And that's a problem that predates, you know, the pandemic. We do have a chapter in the book on the erosion of sort of democracy and human rights over the course of the pandemic, you know, especially with surveillance technologies and how some leaders, you know, used COVID as a reason to crack down, you know, on the population and to bring in new laws that empower them, you know, individual leaders. So I think that is a additional, you know, problem here. But I would say on the upside, you know, populism wasn't destroyed by the pandemic, but I think it may have been an obstacle for it, you know, in that, you know, we often say, oh, COVID's an accelerant, you know, but authoritarianism was on the rise prior to COVID. And that, you know, they encountered a problem in terms of that they were unable to deal with it. Now, you know, if you look at Bolsonaro, he's actually doing still pretty well, you know, politically, but that momentum, I think, has been sort of broken. You know, and one can make an argument that Trump lost because of COVID, although it was maybe closer than people anticipated. So, you know, I think we don't know. That's one of those areas where it's hard to make a, you know, definitive judgment. I mean, I can say on US-China cooperation on global public health, you know, I would be very surprised if they were able to cooperate properly on this going forward. I think we know enough to know that's going to be a very difficult relationship. I think on the balance between authoritarianism and democracy, we don't know enough yet in terms of how it nets out.
And Randy Newnham, local professor here at Penn State Berks and member of the board, asked if you can discuss the ways in which countries like the US and China and others have been using vaccines as tools of geopolitical influence.
Yeah, I'm sort of conflicted on this a little bit. I mean, China's definitely been doing that and making requests of countries in terms of, you know, their own geopolitical interests. Initially, they distributed assistance and they wanted praise for it, you know, and to be lauded for it. With the vaccines, there's some of that, but there's also requests for specific policy changes. And that, of course, is lamentable. And, you know, those, you know, the United States is committed not to doing that. I think, can't remember the exact ratio, but the US is giving like 70, 80%, roughly speaking, to COVAX and maybe 20, 30% reserved for allies and select sort of countries. But it's been very clear that they won't link the vaccine to, you know, favors or to policy. So they may give it to certain countries because of the relationship, but it will come with no strings, you know, attached to it. So there is a bit of a difference there. And I think it's important that countries don't, you know, use this as a geopolitical tool. Having said that, you know, I think it's also important that we get as many vaccines out as possible. And so, you know, I'm pretty cautious and, you know, competitive toward China in terms of the policy I would like. But I think if it is distributing Sinovac or other vaccines, you know, that's a plus, even if those vaccines aren't sort of hugely effective, because we need to get as many people to have some protection, you know, as quickly as possible. I think we need to be collectively and individually doing a lot more, though, to make sure that more effective vaccines are, you know, getting out there and getting into arms.
We are winding down on the questions, so last call to our audience to try and get a few in before we wrap up here. Andre Beret asks, why is the executive branch of world governments active in the pandemic debate while the legislative branches seem to be remaining silent?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the legislative branch, I guess it's hard to know exactly what they could have done in terms of the pandemic response. They did obviously pass the stimulus, you know, bills, especially early on. And I didn't mention that in the remarks, but that was really a complement to the monetary response by the central bank. So that was incredibly important. So I think they did, act quite quickly there. And they also actually interestingly allocated money throughout 2020 for COVAX and for international efforts in the vaccine, which also was quite welcome. And that was, relatively bipartisan. So they did do some things, but ultimately, a lot of this is driven by the executive branch and by the particular agencies. And what we sort of found, was where they're, what Warren Buffett has this famous line that about investment, it's only when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. Well, in this case, it's only when there's a pandemic, you really see how the CDC, FDA, and other agencies are sort of responding to it. And I think we learned a lot about what their actual, response looks like, and where the shortcomings are. And Congress may have a role in, obviously in the hearing side, but also in, in fixing that through legislation. Possibly.
Well, I listened to another podcast recently where they were talking about how kind of since World War II, Congress has moved away from fulfilling their responsibility to declare war, for declarations of war. And
Yeah.
that's why during Vietnam and Korea, the Korean conflict, and even through this war on terrorism, we are more likely to see police actions and use of force authorizations than actual declarations of war. Is there any sense of a similar reluctance in dealing with the epidemic?
I don't think so. I think the question really is, I think it's, I think it's complicated because certainly for Republicans, but also more generally, maybe, the state level has an important role in terms of the state by state response. So there is a possibility, of course, of federal, mandates, but that can be done by the executive, branch. So you start out the responses at the state and city level even. There's a federal response to it. Congress is required maybe for new legislation, major, funding, obviously. The funding did flow pretty easily in 2020, and it's not just on the stimulus piece of it in the CARES Act, it's also on vaccine development. And, some of that money was reallocated unilaterally by the executive branch, but 18 billion in total, one way or the other, is a lot of money. And actually in Europe, the European Parliament was a big constraint on the EU's vaccine development and insisted that, liability questions and overall amounts and the price that was being paid for these vaccines was heavily sort of managed and contained. So I think that, there's a lot of blame to go around in terms of the US pandemic response, but I don't think Congress, will be very high up on the list for me in terms of those actors that, fundamentally failed in their responsibilities in 2020.
Sure, fair enough. You had mentioned earlier in your comments that the pandemic could have been much worse if it was also accompanied by an economic collapse. And I think we arguably did a pretty good job of staving that off, at least during the peak of it. But now we're seeing problems with employment and inflation, and we had this huge flywheel behind our economy and supply chains that came to a grinding halt and could take years to spin up again. Do you have any expectation how you see that playing out, both in the short term, maybe over the next 6 months, but then over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think it's going to have a long tail, and I think it's going to be different in different parts of the world. I think you sort of put your finger on it here, and just the amount of money that's gone into the economy. I mean, obviously, there are those who worry about inflation. I don't have the answer to that. Clearly, I don't think anyone does, but in terms of that will, happen. But I think more broadly, it sets this precedent that, that for sort of the asset sort of class, I guess, there's a different type of economy, a different type of stimulus, than for other people. And it does create that division, I think, economically and in society. And I think that's something, that will need to be dealt with. And of course, weaning ourselves off some of those special measures, that you referred to as well, I think it's very, is very difficult. So I think that's that's a particular challenge. And then in other parts of the world, there are countries that can't really, engage in the type of monetary or fiscal action that the United States did. And so those countries, I think, will be squeezed and will face possible debt crises or other, sort of unwelcome, events. So I think this will be something, that the major, economies will have to, manage very carefully in the coming years.
So I won't ask you, I guess, what that solution is in this session, but maybe we'll get to it next time. So in research, we'll just wind up here, hopefully with a few lighter questions. What was your, in researching and writing the book, what was maybe the most surprising moments or piece of information that you came across as you were putting this all together?
Oh, great question. We found out some stuff about the WHO's response to their own investigation in COVID in January 2021, where when the investigative team said a lab leak was very unlikely, we found out that Tedros, told them they had no authority or information to be able to make that assessment. And they basically ignored him and went ahead with it in their final report, which caused him to go public. So that was, that was definitely interesting. I think the granularity on just the US relationship with the WHO and, also what happened inside the administration early on, was interesting and a little bit surprising, actually, that they were, that they didn't, that they were aware early on of how dangerous this could be, and that some of them were actually working pretty hard on it. So we try to be, fair to them on that one. But I think mainly, Mike, like just the depth of distrust amongst the world leaders, and their really inability to work with each other. We sort of knew that, but then when you just, see some of the comments and the, and how it actually went down, that's pretty bracing. To think, that we would have that in the middle of a global pandemic is sort of extraordinary.
So I've got probably one last question, but before I ask, you do have your book out. We referenced the link in the Atlantic article. That's an essay about the book. Some of the research that you've done for the book, you referenced here a couple of times. Super interesting. We've got an audience of big readers here. What do we need to know about the book? Let's sell the book.
Oh, great. Well, no, thank you. So the book, I'm really excited about the book, and we've obviously talked about it for a while, but I would say it's a few things that that maybe makes it unique. Number one, it's a global perspective. We try to tell the global story of the response to COVID, geopolitically, geographically, economically. So we really try to take that big, sort of broad, view, because everyone experienced this pandemic very locally. But we knew at the time it was a global story. So we try to piece that together, especially for people who maybe were too focused, understandably focused last year on, what was happening to them and to us. That here's maybe a narrative about, how it unfolded around the world. Second thing is we really did try to have an analytical narrative based on reporting and talking to officials and others. And I think there's a lot of things that are sort of surprising in the book. We've mentioned some of them, just especially, how, the US relationship with the WHO, or we talked to a lot of US officials at the US Embassy in China who'd been working in global public health, who'd engaged in their Chinese counterparts over many years. So we try to tell their story, also. So it is an attempt to construct a reported narrative, of the pandemic, and then I think we do try to link it to policy, and we do try to give some suggestions, for what we could do differently, next time. So, this is a writing history in real time, as the event was happening, but we do hope that it has some sort of enduring, lessons and insights that may be helpful if someone was to pick up the book in 5 or 6 years, that it would still be, hopefully still be relevant and helpful at that point.
Perfect. And I assume we can find it on Amazon.
Yeah,
Where
yeah, it
else
should
do
be
people
in
even buy
bookshops and on whatever preferred site or bookshop you have. It should be in all of them.
So let's wrap this up with what in your research writing the book, your experience writing the book, what should we feel most optimistic about right now?
I think our ability to get through this, with an economy intact. I mean, the fatality numbers are very bad, but a lot less than they would have been otherwise. People, the technology helped. The development of the mRNA vaccines, are extraordinary, I think, and a big breakthrough. So I think that is, that's sort of the silver lining to all of this. We should be very worried. We should be depressed about parts of the reaction for sure, but there are also, signs of hope, coming out of it. And I think it was sort of a collective, effort. It wasn't just, I mean, if you think about the vaccines, it wasn't just, government money. It was the private sector. It spanned different continents. There was a strong sort of European component in it. So I think that should make us, sort of optimistic, not complacent, because we don't know if that will work the next time. But, I think it should give us some optimism that this could have, dragged on a lot longer and been a lot worse than it was, as bad as it was.
Dr. Thomas Wright, thank you so much for joining. Loved the topic today. Obviously, we wish it was better news, probably more across the board, but good audience engagement. We had good turnout today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us this afternoon.
Mike, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure, and thank you for everyone for all the great questions. And I really look forward to being able to visit in person at some point in the future.
And you've been with us in person in the past, right? So hopefully we'll see you again.
Yeah.
All right. To wrap things up with us here today, our president, Dr. Saul Lausch.
Thank you.
If we can get him back.
Mike, I think my video is blocked, so let me just say that we want to thank you again also, Dr. Wright. And I want to thank Mike for hosting so wonderfully again. And I really want to thank our program committee headed by David Bean. Folks, as you certainly understand, these programs are not easy to put on. It takes a lot of good communication with a lot of different people to establish speakers. So we thank everyone for that. And we look now forward to our next program coming up on the Caribbean. And thank you everyone for being with us.